explore and investigate the beginning, how this whole Soviet bloc emerged, how the Soviet bloc countries became members of the Soviet Empire, and how this whole Sovietization process took place. Also, it's a very interesting topic for one reason. Why? It happened a very long time ago, and you would imagine that in scholarship after so many years there is a full consensus about how it happened, why it happened, and what were the main motivations of the different actors. It is not the case. Exactly the opposite happens. Even today, the basic same two very different schools maintain their positions, they survive, which same schools basically emerged since the 1950s, 60s about this issue, and these are absolutely having an opposite view about the motivations, how it happened, why it happened. What are these two schools? Well, number one is the so-called traditional school, or orthodox school, as you can call them, which school is basically an American-based scholarly school. It was already emerging in the late 1940s, in the end of the late 1940s, and ever since the school has followers, and new and the younger generation experts who actually keep themselves to the same old argument, which basically says that the Sovietization of East Central Europe was one of the most important causes of the emerging Cold War. So that was the argument which was formulated in the late 1940s and then reinforced in scholarship later decades as well. That is, the Sovietization was a cause, was a kind of motivation, a cause of the emerging Cold War. That is, it caused the deterioration of the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. That's how by 1947 and 48 the whole relationship changed from a previous stage of, if not friendship, but partnership during the war, into a hostile relationship which was known later as the Cold War. Why do they say this? Because of this argument is based on the idea that the Western countries did not agree to the Sovietization of this region of East Central Europe, and then because of this, this created such a friction between the United States and the Soviet Union that eventually this led to the conflict. Let me just try to get a nice map. Nice map over the Soviet bloc, so that you can be sure which countries which countries we are talking about. Let's see this one. This is crazy. We have this all the time. Okay. Yeah, more or less that's what we have here. So as you can see, this is the red is the Soviet Union. Here's Poland, East Germany, that is the German Democratic Republic, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. Originally, at the beginning, during the time we are talking about right now, right after the war, Yugoslavia and Albania were also part of this emerging Soviet bloc. Yugoslavia basically had a split with the Soviet bloc. Later we will talk about that as well. In 1948, and Albania, the small country Albania, also quit the Soviet bloc in 1961. But until that time, Albania was also a formally equal member of the Soviet bloc. So this is the bloc we are talking about, which emerged after the Second World War. All these countries got under Soviet occupation. All these countries were liberated first and then occupied by the Soviet army. when the Soviet front was moving from the east to the west. And this is the kind of demarcation line. The end of the pink area is basically the demarcation line where the Soviet army stopped. With the exception of Austria, which looks like a non-Soviet bloc country, which is true, but also half of, not half, maybe 1/3 of Austria, the eastern part of Austria, was also occupied by the Soviet army, and Austria had a special status between 1945 and 55. It was under four-power occupation, exactly as Germany. Also Vienna, the capital of Austria, was under four-power occupation, just like Berlin. But in 1955, eventually the great powers made a compromise and established Austria as an independent sovereign state, whereby Austria had to declare their eternal neutrality in turn. So that was the Soviet expectation. The Soviets wanted to make Austria a neutral state, which cannot join NATO. That's why Austria never joined NATO. Then, during the Cold War, that was the Soviet plan, and that was successful. So that's the only exception, but otherwise the plan shows basically the demarcation line after the end of the war. These countries which were occupied and liberated and occupied by the Soviet army by the end of the war became parts of the Soviet Empire. Even though in some of these countries the Soviet army remained from the beginning to the end, and in other countries it was not present all the time, it did not make a difference. So you have to remember this because we will talk about this later. It did not make a difference. In Czechoslovakia, the Soviet troops were withdrawn in December 1945, right after the war. The Soviet army withdrew from Czechoslovakia, and up until 1968, in Czechoslovakia there were no Soviet troops. Also, in Bulgaria, the Soviet troops were withdrawn in the end of 1947, after the peace treaty was signed with Bulgaria. So in Bulgaria, throughout the whole Cold War, there were no Soviet troops. And then Bulgaria was the most loyal member of the Soviet bloc, the most Soviet lover, so to say, member of the Soviet bloc, although there were no any kind of Soviet military units in Bulgaria. Also in Romania, there were troops until 1958, but in 1958 the Soviet troops were withdrawn from Romania. Again, during the 60s, 70s, 80s, there were no Soviet troops, but still Romania never quit the Warsaw Pact, never wanted to become a capitalist country. The communist rule was absolutely solid in that country. So the idea or the notion or the condition whether there are Soviet troops in a certain Soviet bloc country or not did not really matter. It's very important because there are many calculations and expert opinions to the contrary. You can read it in serious literature as well, how this was a determining factor. No, it was not, absolutely not. The Soviets could control these countries even without the existence of Soviet troops on the territory of these countries very effectively in many other ways as well. So the idea, getting back to the origins of the conflict, is, according to this traditional or orthodox school, is that the Sovietization of these countries was something which the Western powers could not accept, and that's why they got angry, so to say, with the Soviet Union, and as a retaliation, the relations started to the relations started to deteriorate, conflict was emerging, and eventually this became the Cold War. We can very easily say today, from today's perspective, on the basis of research, not speculation, because at that time all these was based mostly on speculation. Now we can judge the validity of this idea on the basis of documents, and from the basis of documents we can claim this is absolutely not true. It's absolutely not true. Why? Because the Sovietization process actually did not cause such a conflict, because the ongoing Sovietization of the whole region was accepted, tacitly accepted by the Western powers. Tacitly, hopefully you know this word, but it's very important because tacitly, so tacit agreement, again, and tacitly, and I'm checking for the another form, they tacitly accepted this situation. What does it mean? It means that in reality they accepted the situation. They knew that they cannot do anything against the control of East Central Europe by the Soviet Union. But in public, especially to their own public, in Great Britain, in France, and especially in the United States, to their own public, they had to say the opposite. They had to say the opposite. Well, this is politics. We are already here, and of course, if anybody had illusions about the nature of politics, then this is the time to forget about those illusions, because that's what politicians do. That's part of their job, to do one thing and then tell another thing to the public. I don't mean that that's what they have to do, but that's what they usually do. So whether we like it or not, this is happening throughout history, and our present time is not an exception either. However, if you look at history as historians, of course we are not interested in fairy tales, but we are interested in reality, in the real content and the real essence of the issues. So we have to investigate the history of these processes from this perspective. And from this perspective, what we can say is a very simple thing. The Western countries played a double game. They publicly they told, no, we never accept the Sovietization, the Russian control of East Central Europe. This is illegal. This is immoral. This is not legitimate, and we will never agree to this. That was for the public. And in reality, they said, what can we do? And now we can ask also, could they have done anything else? Unfortunately not. Unfortunately not. There was no anything to do by the Western powers, because the Soviet Union had in these countries in their possession since the end of the Second World War, since the spring of 1945. And there was no way to change it, because the Soviet Union would never give it up without any compensation or some kind of deal. And there was no such deal possible on the side of the Western powers. So they simply recognized the situation, and they simply accepted the realities, and they said, okay, we cannot do anything then accept this. So the only option for them would have been to start a war against the Soviet Union. While the Second World War was just over, and then even if you are talking about 1945, the whole Second World War was not even really over, because it ended only in September with the defeat of Japan, as you remember, in September. So under such circumstances, thinking of starting a new world war against the Soviet Union would have been really a very absurd idea, and very futile and very terrible endeavor. So nobody ever was thinking of it. Okay? So if you find any kind of hints in the international literature about, there are always some kind of rumors that even Churchill was thinking of cracking down on the Soviets in a preemptive war, things like that. You can find in many officially serious works. Don't believe that stuff. It had no substance. There were no such real intentions on the Western side at all, and that was quite understandable. Okay, so that's the starting point. The Western powers accepted the realities, and they did not reject the fact that the Soviet bloc, the Soviet Union is controlling the countries of East Central Europe. Of course, they were hoping that the control over East Central Europe will not necessarily be a kind of imminent Sovietization by the Soviet Union. What do we need by imminent Sovietization? This means the Baltic model. What is the Baltic model? The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, were originally occupied by the Soviet Union before the war, or at the beginning of the war, so to say, in 1940. Then they were captured by the German army, so they did not belong to the Soviet Union during the war. But 1944, when the Soviet army started to approach the heart of Europe, then they reoccupied the Baltic states as well. And then those Baltic states, which had been already Sovietized in 1940, in a couple of weeks' time, now they were again re-Sovietized in another couple of weeks' time, right? So all the Soviet model was installed with the one-party system, the planned economy, the dominant role of the Communist Party, and from economy to culture to science and everything else. 100% Soviet model was adopted in those countries in a very short period of time, as I said, in a couple of weeks or months. So this is something which the Western powers were hoping that would not happen to East Central Europe. Okay, although the Soviet Union was in the position to do the same, it did not do the same. And now we are trying to explore why the Soviet Union actually did not do the same. Because we have to claim and also declare that the Soviet Union had every means in their hands and every power to do the same. They could have done it without any problem in all of the countries of the Central European region, with the exception that perhaps in some countries, especially perhaps in Poland, there would have been some social resistance. So there would have been perhaps some fighting. But of course the outcome of the fight is just very predictable. The Soviet Union would have put down any resistance at the time. Don't forget that the Soviet Union had more than 10 million soldiers at that time in Europe on the European front, which was 3 times as big as the Western armies in the western part of Europe. So that is just, again, a very important fact to realize. And as we will see, the Soviet Union chose a different strategy, and we will see why. So, to get back to the original thesis, this orthodox or traditionalist idea that the Sovietization process made the Cold War or caused the Cold War, we can claim that it's absolutely not right. It cannot be verified by research and by facts. But then we have another issue to mention here, because there was a certain role caused by the Sovietization, which did affect the process, but not fundamentally. It did not cause it. It just added to it, and in a certain sense, it became a factor. What is this factor? But indirectly, we can say there was some kind of impact. Why? Because of the Western discourse about Soviet behavior in East Central Europe, in the occupied regions. While the policy-making elite accepted the realities, as I said, the same elite did not tell their own public the reality, that we accepted it, but was preaching the opposite of it. Because of this misleading information, the public, and especially the media, and of course at that time it was not just press, that is printed newspapers and things like that, but also radio. So media started to deal with the fate of the East Central European countries, and the very obvious intervention of the Soviet authorities or the local communists in East Central Europe was time to time criticized in the Western press. And this general criticism eventually added up as a kind of negative attitude towards the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had a very good press at the very end of the war, we shouldn't forget. By 1945, the Soviet army, at that time it was called still the Red Army, had an enormous prestige, because that was the army which more or less defeated Hitler, not entirely, of course, because in the western parts of Europe, the Americans and the British were also fighting fiercely. However, the majority of the fighting throughout the whole war was done by the Soviets. And everybody knew this at that time. By today, it's forgotten. It's forgotten. If you ask an American who won the Second World War, they will say, we Americans. And what about Russians? Well, there were some Russians as well. I don't know where, or they did something as well. No, it's not true, unfortunately. The majority of the fighting and the victims as well were on the Soviet side. 8.5 million soldiers, only soldiers died on the Soviet side. While this was a very small margin, a few 100,000 soldiers on the British and the American side. Okay, so this was an enormous big difference in the fighting, and of course the sacrifices by the Soviet army at that time were still appreciated by the Western parties as well, more or less. By today, public memory is not very grateful to the Soviet army, because, as I said, even their real actions, real importance has been forgotten and is very generally neglected. If you see any Second World War American movie, you will hardly see a Russian soldier fighting, while the brave American soldier is in France or in western part of Germany, is sacrificing his life in a way which shows the heroic American attitude and everything else, the savior of the world, everything else, and the Russians are not even mentioned.
Depends in which part of Europe you are living.
About what? About the movie, or?
Yeah, movies.
You mean that?
Depends also on the movies. Russian movies usually.
No, I was talking about American movies. Of course, in the Russian movies, you have the very same biased picture. There, everything is done by the Russians. You know, there is no American. Okay. Well, and this is not new. It started in the 1950s and 60s. There were a lot of movies made about the Second World War in both cases, both in the American movies or in Hollywood and in the Soviet Union as well. And both of them actually falsified, so to say, history by presenting themselves as the main heroes. But whether we like it or not, believe me, I'm not a big fan of Russia. But the historical fact is that the Russian contribution was much bigger to the general victory, the overall victory, than the contribution by the Western partners. And this is a given fact which is not a big deal for even for Western European historians dealing with the Second World War. But in America, you must be a very brave historian to come up with this very simple thing. Because it's not trendy. It's not trendy. You are regarded as a kind of a traitor. Okay? So it's a terrible thing that so simple, evident, factual things can be interpreted in such a biased way, even today, after many decades, after the end of the Second World War. Okay, so here, as I said, this kind of indirect effect, indirect impact of the negative Western public discourse, that is media, talking about the Soviet Union, really did have a kind of impact in changing the originally positive image of the Soviet Union as the winner of the Second World War, into an enemy image. And this actually happened just in a couple of years, from 45 to 47. And this was more or less due to media. Media already had an enormous role, of course, in the mid 20th century. as it has an enormous role today as well. And this was just traditional media, it was not yet Facebook and Twitter and things like that. American presidents did not Twitter at that time, in the time of Roosevelt. But still, the media did its best to change the image of the Soviet Union into a kind of dangerous potential opponent, and then from an opponent, actually an enemy. So in that sense, in this whole image, in this whole process, the debate over East Central Europe did play a certain role, we can add. But again, it's very important to make a difference. It was not a fundamental role. The whole policy, the policy of the United States did not change into a negative one vis-à-vis the Soviet Union because of East Central Europe, because that did not play a role in that. Then let's see the other school, what we call the revisionist school. Revisionist school, which emerged in the 1950s and especially in the 1960s. What was this revisionist school about? You know? Well, they actually had another very different opinion about the role of the Sovietization of East Central Europe. And they said that it was a consequence. It was not a cause, but it was a consequence of the emerging Cold War. This revisionist school, of course, was looking at Soviet policies at a much more permissive way. In a much more permissive way, they were much more understanding to Stalin's policies, to Soviet policies, and much more critical to American policies. So this was kind of a younger generation of historians emerging in America. Again, this school is an American school, funnily. So we are still talking about the same country. And then still another group of scholars comes up with their very different, very opposite interpretation. They say, no, it was not the Soviet Union who caused the Cold War in such a sense, or who contributed to this by Sovietizing this region. But actually they claim that the Soviet leadership did not want to Sovietize originally this region up until 1947. So they came up with this thesis that Stalin was so nice that he just wanted some kind of friendly states on the western border of the Soviet Union, and he never thought of introducing communist systems in these countries. He was satisfied with nice collaborating friendly governments which would not pose a danger to the western borders of the Soviet Union anymore. But this was also a very naive political inclination or politically biased a new approach to the same issue. And also they were very critical to the American leadership. Why? Because by that time many documents pertaining to the war, the last years of the war, 1945, 44, 45, were open to research. So more and more documents were available, and from those documents they realized that America had a very proactive role at the last stages of the war in 44 and 45 especially. So they improved it into a kind of theory about American expansionism. So they tried to pose the situation in a way that, well, it was American expansionism which caused the problem, and the Soviet Union only had to react to this eventually. Definitely there was such an American expansionism, especially in the economic sphere. However, this again was not the key element here. So they said that until 1947 there was no plan by Stalin to Sovietize these countries, and he changed his mind. He was forced to actually Sovietize these countries, introduce communist rule in the countries of East Central Europe after the Marshall Plan. After the Marshall Plan, which was announced in June 1947. But everybody has learned about the Marshall Plan. in previous studies. I'm not going into details about the Marshall Plan itself, which was about the reconstruction of Western Europe. It was an American aid program which actually allocated $13 billion at that time, not today's dollar, for the reconstruction of the western part of Europe, which was a successful process, and it ended in the early 1950s. But the problem with the plan was that it was also officially offered to the East Central European countries and the Soviet Union itself, while the strings attached to the program were such that it was absolutely obvious from the beginning that the Soviet Union would never accept it. Okay? Because it was political control, which was the political control was exercised by the American government over the whole project of the Marshall Plan. So this would have been absolutely unacceptable for the Soviet government at the time to comply with those very strict conditions of accepting the plan. And there are many other circumstances as well, but this is the main problem. The Marshall Plan created a big trap for Stalin eventually, because that meant that if he accepted the program and participation in the program, then he would allow Eastern Europe as well to maintain American influence, economic influence over that region, which now belonged to the Soviet Union. But if he decided, as he decided eventually, to reject the plan, then it was the Soviet Union who took responsibility for splitting Europe. That's exactly the big problem with the Marshall Plan. It was a very tricky project because it was never meant to be given to the Soviet Union. But officially it was said, yes, it is for everybody. Well, that was the most tricky plan ever, perhaps, or at least in the 20th century. There were not many such tricky projects. By doing this, and basically it was the United States who divided Europe into two blocks: the Western bloc, the countries which accepted the Marshall Plan, and the other part of Europe, the countries which did not accept the plan. So the Western bloc, which was never at that time in 1947, was not officially established, but still it was de facto. It was a block of countries participating in the Marshall Plan. This was initiated and done by the United States government. So, if the Marshall Plan is responsible for the vision of Europe, and it is, believe me or not, absolutely true, so then it is the United States who was responsible for the division. However, we also have to ask the question, so should they have done something differently? So was it a big problem? Was it an evil plan, really, as the Soviets depicted it? No, it was a good plan. It was a necessary good plan to save Western Europe from Soviet political influence. So that was very necessary at the time, because Western Europe was really under the danger of Soviet influence. And by the Marshall Plan, the consolidation and the rehabilitation of the economies of the rehabilitation of Western European economies actually saved Western Europe from political impact from the Soviet Union through the communist parties functioning in countries like France and in Italy, where those communist parties were not just very powerful, very popular, but they were also members of the coalition governments of the time. So in parliamentary elections, in principle, those communist parties actually could have won elections. It never happened, but technically it could have done. It could have been the case. So that was something which the American plan wanted to thwart and to stop. And it was a successful project in that sense. So we can say this was a necessary step on the side of the Americans. Still, its impact, which was an unintended consequence, as we call it, unintended consequence, it did play a major role in the division of Europe. However, the tricky outcome was that the division was not blamed on America, but blamed on the Soviets. Why? Because Soviets took on the responsibility of officially officially declaring their own bloc, the Soviet bloc, and also officially declaring that from now on, that was in September 1947, from now on there are two hostile camps in the world, the peace-loving Soviet Union and the peace-loving Soviet bloc countries, and on the other side, of course, there is the American-led imperialist camp, including everybody who is not with the Soviet bloc. And of course, this very black and white picture, black and white political declaration really did play a very important role in the actual division, especially in the propaganda field of Europe, while, as I said, the real responsibility was on the side of the United States. However, they never had to accept that responsibility. They were never blamed for that responsibility. But the Soviet Union took that responsibility, so to say, voluntarily, by creating the two camps theory and making this the cornerstone of their international policies after 1947. They also established the Cominform, which was the information bureau of the Communist parties in East Central Europe, which became a regional international organization, which actually brought together all the countries of the region into one bloc led by the Soviet Union. So then, going back to the original question, so is it true that before 1947 the Soviet Union didn't want to Sovietize these countries? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So this claim is also absolutely not true. Why? Because the Sovietization process, that is the transformation of the political, especially the political structure and life of these countries, started as early as the Soviet army stepped on the soil of these countries. It started in the summer of 1944. Summer and the fall of 1944, most of these countries already had Soviet troops on their soil. All the countries became under Soviet occupation by the spring of 1945. And the Sovietization process actually started right away. We will go into details a little bit later in another section of this lecture about what the Sovietization actually meant, how it was done. But at that time, when we are talking about the theoretical concept and the theoretical background, we have to declare that the Sovietization process started as early as the summer of 1944. And then it was sped up in the spring of 1946. A lot of people, even today, do not even know about this, but archives, documents from the archives of the former Soviet bloc countries, especially Hungarian archives, evidently prove that in the spring of 1945 there was an encouragement from Stalin to speed up this process and be much more proactive, much more aggressive in their building communist power in the countries of East Central Europe. And then this whole process eventually once more was sped up in late 1946 and early 1947, which eventually turned into a full communist takeover by the end of that year, 1947. But all of these happened much earlier than the Marshall Plan, which was in June 1947. So the original claim of the revisionist school that before 1947 nothing happened and Stalin only reacted to the American plan, the Marshall Plan, is absolutely unfounded, and is absolutely not true. We can see that the Soviets were already on the way of establishing their communist rule in the countries of East Central Europe much earlier than the Marshall Plan. So in that sense, of course, we can say it was absolutely not a consequence of the Sovietization. Was not a consequence of the ongoing Cold War, because the Cold War was also emerging. That is, the worsening of relations, the deterioration of relations between East and West was going on since the end of the war, step by step. But it reached really the breaking point after the Marshall Plan. But in the meantime, by the time the Sovietization process was, if not yet fully in place, but it was almost in a very little proximity to full Sovietization. And then in the last months of 1947, that's exactly what happened. So what happened after the Marshall Plan was completing the Sovietization process and to order a total takeover in all countries of the Soviet bloc. In previous times, that is in 45, 46, we can actually identify two kinds of countries in the Soviet bloc. This is my own categorization. There are countries which we call quasi-Sovietized countries, and there are two countries which are in the category of pre-Sovietized countries. Quasi-Sovietized countries means that the countries in which the political power was in reality almost totally in the hands of the communists already. Although there were still coalition governments, there were many elements of the democratic structure, but from a political point of view, they had a dominant power over the political structures already in 1945-46. This is basically all the countries: Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Albania, and even East Germany, which was not a state at that time. It was just an occupation zone of the Soviet Union, but basically the same processes were going on in that zone as well. And there were two countries, Czechoslovakia and Hungary, which belong to the category which are established as the pre-Sovietized countries. In these two countries, the non-communist opposition still had very important positions in Czechoslovakia as well, in Hungary as well, up until the middle or the end of the year 1947. We are not going into details what kind of elements we are talking about here, but here the non-communist opposition had an important, very important role and important position. In Hungary, actually there was a governing party, the Smallholders Party, which was a Western type non-communist party, which won 57% of the elections in 1947, in 1945, in November 1945. 57% of the votes, which means that they had a large majority in the government. So the prime minister was from this party, the president was this party, the leader of the speaker of the parliament was from the Smallholders Party, and so on and so on. So formally, they had very important positions yet at that time. Also in Czechoslovakia, the president was Beneš, the same Beneš who was the president before the war. Who was also leader of the emigre government in London during the war. So it looked like everything is all right. From this perspective, nothing is lost yet in Czechoslovakia and in Hungary. But this was also not true, because pre-Sovietization means that even in these two countries, which actually could present the most spectacular images of still maintained democratic elements, even in these two countries the system was already totally undermined by the communists already in 1945 and in 1946. Okay, so now that's why I'm saying after the establishment of the Cominform, which happened in September 1947, the task was the task was to fully Sovietize these countries, to make a full total takeover by the communist parties, which happened in Hungary by the end of the year, and in Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1948. Also, this founding conference of the Cominform had another goal as well, to establish the Eastern camp, the Soviet camp. Until these countries did not have any kind of close relationship with each other. On the contrary, sometimes they had very important quarrels with each other. Poland and Czechoslovakia had territorial quarrels. Hungary and Romania also huge conflicts with, because of territory, which both parties claim, and so on and so on. But now all this had to be forgotten. Everybody had to be good communists, and everybody had to look to Moscow and take the orders from Moscow. So now the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Bloc, had to be established. And then this was, as I said, the most important task of the establishment of the Comintern as a regional organization, regional international organization of the communist parties. By the way, this was an organization of the parties, not the states. It was the organization of the communist parties functioning in all those states, which was in existence up until April 1956. In April 1956, the Comintern was disbanded, and no such international communist organization was re-established anytime later. But that's a different story. We can get back to that later a little bit. But the Comintern basically did not have a big role in the 1950s at all. Now, so let's see the Sovietization process itself. You know, what was this about, and what were the main goals of the Sovietization process? First of all, it had two major strategic goals. Number one, it had to be done in a way, and that was number one priority for Stalin, to maintain cooperation with the West. It had to be done in a way that the Soviet Union would be able to maintain cooperation with the Western countries in the meantime. Why was this important for Stalin? Was he such a big lover of the Western countries? Well, not really. He was a good communist, and he hated the West and hated imperialism, and he was sure that imperialism will be dead very soon because of internal conflicts in the Western world, and so on and so on. However, what he wanted, of course, was very simple. What everybody wants is money. Okay? He wanted money from the United States, because the only country who had money after the end of the Second World War was the United States. Of course, Great Britain was a winner of the war, but was almost as poor as the Soviet Union, because Great Britain was in terrible devastation after the war. Not to talk about France and many other countries which actually were on the winning side, but still they were technically victims themselves from an economic point of view. The United States, on the other hand, was the greatest victor of the war in every possible sense, especially economically. Economically, we have an enormous number from 1945. You should remember this. Half or 50% of the whole world's industrial output was made in the United States in 1945. 50% of all of the world's, all of the countries at that time counted. 50%. This number was never so big, of course, before 1945, and never was so big after 1945. But during the very last stages of the war in 1945, this was the number. 50% of every industrial production happened in the United States. That's an unbelievable number. So this also meant that the United States was in a very good shape economically. Although, of course, at the same time, all the other actors, especially the Soviet Union, was terribly devastated because of the losses suffered during the war, which was not just human losses. The Soviet Union also lost altogether 27 million inhabitants, people, 27 million. While in the United States, no such thing happened, okay, because civilians did not die during the Second World War. Out of these 27, 8.5 were the soldiers, but all the others, almost 20 million, were the civilians. And we haven't mentioned the enormous devastation in cities and industries and factories and many other things, which of course caused a very dire situation in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, of course, had most of its developed industry on the western part of the country, exactly the part which was under German occupation. during the war. So all those territories were terribly devastated. So the Soviet Union very much needed economic support, help, and they were hoping up until 1946, even up until early 1947, that they can get this economic aid or at least loan from the United States. Okay, that was on the one hand very logical, and they would have deserved it, as they imagined that okay, we fought the war, we had tremendous sacrifices, so we need some help. And the Americans actually did make promises. They made promises, but eventually they did not meet those promises. So from 1945 on, they started to regard the Soviet Union much more as an opponent than as an ally. And from this perspective, of course, it was not very much desirable to support your future opponent. That was also a rational logic. So they played again a double game. They were promising, okay, yes, maybe, but they never actually gave the support to the Soviets anymore. Although during the war, of course, they were supporting the Soviets with a lot of supplies during the Lend-Lease supplies. But all that ended in the spring of 1945, and then the expected big loans. At some point, it was about $6 billion loan, what the Soviets were hoping for. It never came. But this need, this very bad economic situation was behind the idea which I just mentioned at the beginning. The Soviet Union wanted to Sovietize East Central Europe, but in an invisible way, so that this would not harm the relationship with the United States. Okay? Because if there is a very outright and very bloody Sovietization, let's say civil war going on, whatever, in East Central Europe, that would have been very difficult for the American government to sell to their own public. Why do we support the Soviet people or the bloody dictator in Moscow when he's killing the people of East Central Europe? And we are giving them money and equipment, everything. So that would not really work, right? So the expectation was we have to do everything in silently, in an invisible way, that the American government could sell this to their own public, that nothing is lost in Eastern Europe. Nothing is that bad, you know, what is the problem? They have parliaments, they have a lot of things that almost looks like democracy. Okay, so what's the problem? So that was the number one requirement, maintaining cooperation with the West. Number two was that to pursue a gradual Sovietization process, a process of gradual Sovietization, and build domination over the region with the help of the local communist parties. Through gradual Sovietization. That was a different model, a very strikingly different model from the Baltic states, which I mentioned at the beginning, what I call the Sovietization overnight. That is that right away, very strict thing. No, it had to be done in a step-by-step way. Step-by-step way. So these were the two strategic goals: cooperation with the West and gradual Sovietization of the region. Then, this was the reason why they did not apply the Baltic model of Sovietization overnight. So immediate Sovietization was out of the question. On the contrary, they were playing a double game exactly as the Americans were, mentioned earlier. They said, what is communism? We don't even know what that is. The local communist parties had to pretend that they never heard of it. Well, this is a little exaggeration. Of course, they heard about it, but they had to claim that, no, we don't want communism. No, we don't want the model of Moscow to be installed in this country. No, we only want democracy. Well, what is the problem with democracy? Everybody loves democracy, so everything is all right. Well, that was the misleading starting point for the communists. They had to pretend that they are only one of the democratic parties. People who are just trying to improve the welfare of the country, they want to rebuild it, they want to conduct a kind of democratic policy, a democratization policy, and so on and so on. And they outright denied denied the idea that they would ever try to introduce communist rule in that country. So what was the goal with this? You know, they had to prepare. The dominant position of the communist parties for a future takeover. The takeover was not an imminent goal to do it right away. No, on the contrary, you had to say no. We don't plan that, but actually you start working on this secretly. Okay. Nobody else knew this, but the communist leaders absolutely knew what they were doing. And for this, they used a very important strategy, which was a recycled strategy, so to say, because it came from the 1930s. That's what we call the Popular Front strategy. The Popular Front strategy, what was the Popular Front? It was a kind of coalition building policy, which was initiated by the Soviet Union in the 1930s, when the fascist danger was looming over Europe. In countries like France and Britain and Spain and other countries where there was not yet fascism, like in Germany and Italy already. It was too late. But in other countries, the danger of fascism or some kind of fascist rule was there. So they ordered the local communist parties to ally with all democratic elements, all democratic parties, bourgeois parties, not just social democrats, but also many other bourgeois parties who were not representatives of the finance capitalists, that is the extreme right-wing political circles, to form a coalition government against a danger from the fascist side. And this policy, of course, was applied in several countries in Western Europe, and two examples were the French and the Spanish examples. In France, it did work well, because in France there was never any real danger of fascism in the late 1930s, and there were Popular Front coalition governments functioning during the second half of the 1930s. And they could avoid this kind of development which would lead the country into a fascist direction. But in Spain, as we know, there was a civil war in which the coalition of Popular Front was working for a while, but then when it met a challenge from the fascist side, from General Franco, eventually in that very fierce fight for several years, from 1936 to 1939, eventually the coalition was defeated. The Popular Front was abducted by the fascist opponents. However, this idea of this broad coalition of democratic parties was now reintroduced in Eastern Europe after 1945. So the order from Moscow was exactly the same. Okay, so you should come together with all the democratic parties and you govern in coalition with the democratic parties for the reconstruction of the country to introduce all kinds of democratic reforms in your country and not to fight for the particular interests of the working class, not to talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat, which was previously, of course, the #1 strategic goal of every communist party. No, you have to forget about that. You only pretend that you are only working for democracy. Okay? So, on the basis of all that, and on the basis of this Popular Front strategy, what do we see? What emerged during that period in these countries was a dual policy. First of all, there was an appearance in all those countries. There was an appearance of democratic structures. We also call it a democratic facade. Democratic facade. Democratic facade, which looks like democratic, but it's actually just an illusion. It's not really what the one it looks like. The appearance of democratic structures for from 1944, basically up until 1947, the late months of 1947, this was the official expectation from Moscow. That's what you have to do. Why was this necessary? Exactly because of the cooperation, maintaining cooperation with the Western countries. This was very much needed for Stalin to convince the Western policymakers, especially the Americans, look, you were afraid that we would Sovietize these countries. Have we done it? No, nothing happened. You have parliaments, you have coalition governments, you have a lot of things which are looking exactly like in the western part of Europe. So what is the problem? So please tell your people, there is nothing to do here, please deal with something other. So that was the substance. That was the substance. Well, that's the appearance and the substance. Sorry, the substance was of course very different from that. The substance was building pre-Sovietization. That is to build up dominant positions for the local Communist Party for a future takeover. When that order from Moscow comes at any certain moment, it could come at any time, then you would be able to use those dominant positions within the political economic structures of that country to make a takeover basically overnight, or actually in a very short period of time, also in such a way that it would not lead to civil war. Okay? So your positions must be so strong, your control over many fields of the structures must be so strong, especially the military, the secret police, and many others, that in that country, if this order comes, you would be able to execute this plan very swiftly and without real bloodshed. Right? So that was the dual policy, appearance and substance. And actually that's what happened in 1947, 1948. So what was this democratic image about? The democratic image had basically four elements, what we have to remember. Number one is the parliamentary system. The parliamentary system remained in place. In all these countries of the region there were parliaments, Western type parliaments, at least formally, because before the Second World War, out of the region's countries, only Czechoslovakia was a real democracy. All the other countries were basically authoritarian parliamentary systems. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and so on. But they had a parliament in which there were several parties and elections, everything else. So the parliaments remained. It was very important because in the Soviet Union there was no parliament. This European type parliament did not exist. Number two, the multi-party system was also maintained. So it was easy to argue that, okay, it's not just the communists who are conducting the governing of the country, but it's all the coalition parties. So there are multi-parties. Number three, it was coalition governments. That is an obligatory system of coalition governments. It was also very interesting because coalitions were everywhere, but this was obligatory because of the Soviets. The Soviets gave the order that whatever the actual situation is, you must govern in a coalition. Even in countries like Yugoslavia or Albania, when they could have governed without any coalition partners because they were so strong already from the beginning, 1945. They had to pretend that they have a coalition government. Okay? So they technically established the coalition government so that the Western public could see that these countries too are governed by coalition governments. Yeah. And these coalition governments were quite broad ones. In some cases, real grand coalitions with all the existing parties in the coalition. But as I said, this was not a voluntary decision based on the order by the Soviets. Also, here we must mention that in several countries, like in Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, even the monarchy was maintained for a while. Because this also was part of the facade. Look in Bulgaria, in Romania, there is a king, and people are talking about communist domination and the communist having full power. Whoever has seen a communist king? No, it's crazy. They have a nice king, so it must be everything must be all right, and the accusations must be false. Well, of course, the accusations were not false, but keeping the monarchies also was part of the game until a while, of course. And number 4 is the elections, the multi-party elections. Elections were held in most of these countries already in 1945, and in some other countries in 1946. And in Poland, the most problematic country, only in January 1947. But in the previous, in the other countries, actually already in 45. We will see how this how these elements actually were functioning in reality. Well, let's see the parliaments. Parliaments really did exist. Technically, they were in place all the time, but the parliaments were not the real place for policy making. Real decisions were not made by the parliaments, and in many cases, actually, the parliaments were not even used to make laws, because the governments were governing by decrees, government decrees, which means that the parliament authorized the government officially to issue decrees which were equivalent of a law adopted by the parliament. But of course it gave the government a great power, and the government could change everything easily in such a way. In Romania, in the summer of 1946, very simply, the prime minister abolished the upper house of the parliament itself without any big problem, because he said, well, we don't need it. Well, in normal conditions, of course, this would never happen, but under such transitory conditions, this could actually happen. So the parliaments, again, existed, they looked nice, they projected the political situation as democratic, but no real decisions were made there. Where were the real decisions made? Well, partly in the government, but more importantly, there was a new element of the system, the inter-party conferences. Inter-party conferences, you have heard very little about this, because very little is known even for scholars, experts, about this crucial element of the structure, which meant that the representatives of the coalition parties, which were represented in the government, came together time to time, maybe every week or every second week, unofficially. These were unofficial meetings, represented by 2 persons of each party. So this meant that, let's say in a 4-part coalition, every party had a 25% representation, because they were represented by the same number of people. While in reality, let's say in Hungary, 57% of the smallholders governing party was of course much more than 25, while the Hungarian communists had only 17% at the elections, and here in this inter-party conferences they had 25, as everybody else. Okay, so this already gave an enormous possibility for the communist parties, the local communist parties, to have a much greater say in the governing of that particular party than would be logical on the basis of their legitimate role based on the election results. And at these unofficial meetings, which actually happened very randomly, of course, everything could happen in a much more flexible way. That also meant that the Communist Party's representatives could actually tell their partners things which they could not tell at the government cabinet meetings, which were about what? It was very simple. Well, Comrade Voroshilov, who was the head of the Allied Control Commission in Hungary, because in defeated countries like Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, there were Allied Control Commissions headed by a Soviet general. Marshal Voroshilov was the Hungarian head of the Hungarian Commission. And then the communist leader just put Marshal Voroshilov doesn't like this proposal. And who had the chance to talk to Marshal Voroshilov, of course? from the other parties. No, no, he didn't. No, it's real. No, he doesn't like it. Well, if he doesn't like it, what can we do? Okay. And then the decision was, okay, fine. I didn't mean it. Right? And there was no any kind of sign of this because it was absolutely kept in silence. It was happening in total secrecy, and the people who actually knew it, even on the bourgeois side or the non-communist party side, they were of course ashamed of this situation, so they never made it public themselves, because it was of course very difficult to confess that nominally, namely, we have a nice position. I'm the prime minister. And then I have to agree to a lot of things which I don't like, just because we are under heavy pressure from the Communist Party and the Soviet Union, the representatives of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Army. But nothing of this is visible to anybody, not only in Hungary, especially of course in the Western countries. Nobody knew nothing about that. And even things that the next thing could happen, and then we actually finished. One night, the Hungarian Prime Minister was woken up by telephone. Marshal Voroshilov wants you to appear in his headquarters right away. And then the Hungarian Prime Minister had to jump into a car sent for him in pajamas and have a conversation with Marshal Voroshilov during the night, which was not about having a nice party next week, but about some hard stuff, which was a kind of demand on the side of the Soviet government vis-à-vis the Hungarian government, and the poor pajama prime minister, of course, had to say, of course, what can I do? Okay, let's do it. Okay. So this is just a kind of appetizer. It's not yet over, so now we have to stop, but the story will continue next week as well. So thank you for your attention. So now we have the